Well, hello, this is Steve Wiggum, and welcome to the fourth lesson of 12 on living Christianly in a pluralistic culture. We're starting with Islam, one of the largest religions in the world, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation for us. And we're actually going to have to spread it over three parts in order to be able to cover it fully. As you know, we've been going through many of the world's religions, and that's what our plan is for the whole this whole series of talks. This time, we're going to be focusing on the Muslim community. And Muslims, even though they're a very small part of the United States culture, this is the where I'm from, the United States, we see that Muslims are the third largest of all of the religions, besides those who call themselves secular and atheist, underneath Judaism, but they could very well be the number two religion in the United States and within the next 10 years. But in the world, we see that it is the second largest to Christianity of the entire world religions. You see, it's a huge, huge part of the world community as opposed to just what's in the United States. And of course, if you've been paying attention at all to any of the news lately, it's hard not to find a day where there's not some headline that involves the Muslim community in the news. So we're going to talk a little bit about what they believe, and what it means for us who are working and living in a world very similar and that interacts with the Muslim community from time to time. I would like to remind us of our definition of religion. This is the one we're using to kind of frame our conversation. And with this definition, actually everyone in the world is religious in some shape, form, or fashion. And we're using this definition because it's really helpful to help us understand exactly how to really differentiate between the religions. And what the definition of religion really is telling us is that it is a way of ordering one's life. So our religion dictates what kind of decisions we make, what kind of things that we choose to value, what kind of things we choose to emphasize, how we structure our family lives, everything. It's the way we order our lives based on what we perceive as ultimate reality. So this is very much as true for the Christian as it is for the Muslim, but is also true for the atheist. They order their lives based on what they perceive as ultimate reality. And for Islam, it's no less the case. So we're going to understand what their perception of ultimate reality is. And I think it'll help us understand some of the practices and some of the ways that they go about living their lives. I want to remind you also about a conversation we've been having all along, is that, how do people choose their religion? We find out that most people, in most situations and at most times, will actually choose the religion of their culture or their family, or a combination of the two. We do have some people who do migrate from one religion to another that is contrary to their culture or family, and but that's much more rare than the people who actually practice the religion of their culture and their family. And so that's the primary motivation. So think about why you are practicing the religion that you're practicing. Is it because you converted from a culture and a family that believes something entirely different, or have you chosen that culture, that religion based upon just because it was right there all around you? I know that when I first started struggling with my faith, that was a big issue. I just didn't know if I was choosing Christianity just because it was the most convenient and most accepted in my social circles, or whether it was the truest of all religions. And so be mindful that people who are Muslim are facing the same thing. They're choosing their religion mainly just because of their family and also for their culture. People who do migrate from one religion to another usually are affected by the three transcendentals: the truth of the religion, the goodness of that religion, and its beauty. When I've heard many converts to Islam, I find many stories about experiencing the month of Ramadan and the fasting and just how beautiful of a time it is. And people are just so moved by that, or the daily prayers. Those things are really important to people, and they see the beauty of this, and that becomes very important, and that leads them to the truth of Islam. Some people see the goodness and you can see a lot of this actually in the United States. The history of the Black Muslim movement, Malcolm X, of course, being one of their leading spokespeople back in the 60s. The goodness that movement created inside of a culture of the inner city Black community that really was very profound and it drew a lot of people to that religion because of its goodness. So we see that there are ways to actually engage people with the religion that sometimes maybe even better than trying just to go straight for truth. Truth is a difficult thing to attack first off, mainly just because beauty and goodness seem to be easier to connect with for people. And then when they start to connect to that level, then the truth of what's behind the beauty and goodness actually becomes real and becomes acceptable. So, and that's really how a lot of people have switched, whether it's from Christianity to Islam, Islam to Christianity, Christianity to atheism, atheism to Christianity. All these things, you'll find these transcendentals involved. And I think it's really important for us to understand that sometimes it's best to lead with the beauty and goodness of a religion, to really tell your story into the marketplace of ideas, instead of just going after truth. Not that truth is not important, it's just that there's just a natural barrier for people just to accept a truth statement from something it does not know or does not appreciate yet. So, the important thing for us to remember as we go forward. We've also talked about worldviews, and we have in the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about Judaism and also the pluralism of Christianity. And it's been very familiar to us who are in the Christian community because Judaism and Christianity are very closely aligned in their worldview. Both Judaism and Christianity has a supernatural creator and a cosmic justice system in place where there is actually right and wrong in the world. Supernatural involvement. We see that God is very much involved both in Judaism and in Christianity, and also a supernatural relationship. The God of the Jews and the God of the Christians are seeking in relationships. Now that we start talking about Islam, we see also a supernatural creator and a cosmic justice structure inside of the teachings of Islam. But we also see supernatural involvement. We see God involved. We see the angel Gabriel. We'll talk a lot about him today. The supernatural relationship is not nearly as important in Islam as it is in Judaism and Christianity. We'll talk a little bit about that. So this is actually where it starts to feel unfamiliar to many of us who have only seen a Christian worldview or a Judaic worldview, that there is a somewhat difference, a little bit of different flavor to the way that they look at the world. And that's important for us to understand. So we'll be dealing with that during this talk. I do want to remind you of a story in the New Testament, Christian New Testament, in Acts 17. It's a story about Paul. And when he goes to Athens and he meets the great debaters in Athens at the Areopagus, he talks to them about their religion. So it's really kind of an engagement in a pluralistic culture there. And so that's the reason why we're using it as kind of as a model of thinking. And I think there's some really important and profound ideas that Paul makes available to us. Some of the observations we can take, and I encourage you to read that passage. Just pull out your Bible and take a look at that. Go online, and you can find many online resources if you don't have a Bible. But Acts 17, verses 16 through 34, here's what we notice. First of all, that Paul observed the people around him. He was very much aware of what the people were like around him. And he also was willing to engage with them. He didn't treat them as something totally other that was something to be avoided. So I think that's really important to us to understand. Also, he spoke positively. In other words, he did not just come out and just rail against people who practiced other religions. He actually looked into it and said, there's some good at what they're doing. There's some interesting ideas that they are pursuing that need to be acknowledged. And he also spoke intelligently. He knew about their traditions. And that's the reason why these talks are happening right now, is for us to be able to use some of that kind of logic and kind of perspective as we go into a pluralistic society. We also see Paul that he inserted the gospel as a completion of their worldview. He did not try to upend their worldview entirely, but he said, what the things that you've been looking for and desiring and things that you have been focusing on, look at what actually the gospel does to help enhance that. When he started talking about their praying to the unknown God, he says, let me tell you about that unknown God. And he tells a wonderful story that really kind of refreshes the stories that they have and helps them understand some of the things that they did not understand. And another thing that's really important for us to remember is that not everyone converted, but some did. And that's going to be our experience in the world. We're not going to be able to just be able to wholesale change everyone's religion to ours, but we can start a conversation and do what we can, and we will see some people who will be willing to accept. The heart of man is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to speak truth in love, and that's our job. Another thing I want us to remind ourselves is that we are using the great theologian Christopher Stendhal's 3 rules of religious understanding. I think they're very profound and they're very clarifying, and we've been using it here on purpose, especially when we get into Islam, is that we're going to learn about Islam from its adherents, not its enemies. So we're not looking for people who are trying to issue vindictives against the Muslim community. Don't compare your best to their worst, which is very tempting to do. There's some very noticeable Islamic activity out there that is something that is considered their worst, and for us just to pick on that as being totally representative of that faith would be problematic. So I don't want us to do that. Also, we need to leave room for holy envy. What we mean by that is that they're doing some things that are really important and really interesting that could very much be very helpful to us, and as we try to worship and live out the lives that our religion calls for. So be aware of that as we go through. We'll try to call those out as we go along. And I think it'll be a great ride. Let's talk a little bit about Islam in particular. This will be our focus for the next 3 conversations. Islam is a majorly significant religion today. And 1 out of every 5 people in the world that you would meet will actually consider themselves Muslim. And Islam and Muslim, of course, are just built off the same name. Let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to divide up the next 2, part 1 and part 2. And part 3 is going to be just an open discussion on some fine points. But part 1, we're going to talk about the history of Islam. It's important we understand that. It will put everything that we are learning in perspective. And it will also help us as we get into understanding the Qur'an a little bit better, that we understand the history of Islam. I think there are some things that we can learn, and there's some parallels that can be understood. We'll also talk about Islamic theology and some of the tenets of their theology that was really important for us, and also draw some stark contrasts to Christianity and Judaism. So it's important for us to know that. The next talk, we're going to be talking about what it's like to be a Muslim, and so we'll break down just the daily kind of life. We'll also look at Islam and Christianity, how that they view Christianity. We'll talk a little bit about that today. We'll go a little deeper on next conversation. We'll also talk about Sharia law, which is a big topic today, about what it means, and we won't be able to go into full detail, but it'll give us a little bit more perspective that may clarify some of the things that seem to be very confusing out there in the common conversation of the day. Also, we'll talk about jihad, which is a major conversation that we need to have. A lot of Muslim clerics and jurists believe that is the 6th pillar of Islam. We'll talk about the 5 pillars today, but that's the 6th pillar, and we're going to break that down and understand a lot of the conversations that are happening in and around it, and I think that will be a surprising conversation. And the 4th, well, actually the 5th, I actually got 2 2s in this, my apologies on this slide, but then we'll talk about how do we engage Muslims. And so that'll be the last thing we do. Let's talk about Islam. The name itself actually is based on the word submission. And that means to really, almost to cower to, or to surrender to something, and that is to the will of Allah. And so that's what we mean. That's what Islam means at its core. Now, when in the early the classic Arabic that the Quran is written in, back then they like the Hebrew writing, they didn't use a lot of placeholders for vowels. So SLM, salam, actually sometimes has been they've linked Islam to the term of peace. Matter of fact, if you remember President George Bush saying, no, Islam means it is a religion of peace. And that is a big conversation happening today inside of Islam itself, and also around Islam, as people trying to figure out how to incorporate the Islamic religion into a modern secular world. And so that they were using this idea of Islam as peace. And then you start to see some contrast. Here's a picture of a soldier who's fighting for ISIS, the new Islamic State that has been declared with a new caliphate. And they are choosing not the path of peace. They're actually choosing the path of active jihad against the infidel. And so we have to ask the question, is Islam really a religion of peace? And we're going to really kind of tear that apart over the next couple of conversations and really try to understand. And we'll find out that there's really a battle for the soul of Islam right now inside of Islam itself. Those people who are trying to progress the religion forward into a much more accommodating, modernistic religion, and those who are saying, no, we need to run back to the very teachings of Muhammad and run back to the elemental parts of the religion from the very beginning of the Islamic faith. And so that war is really very pronounced. We in the West have just seen the fruits of that in the 1970s. It really started really becoming front and center for us during, the Iran when the Ayatollah Khomeini and a lot of the people in Iran took over and from the government and became its own religious state. That's when it became real for the United States. Of course, you remember the people who were actually captured by the new religious groups inside of Iran, and that created all kinds of problems for us. And that's when we started to actually interact with a part of Islam that was really at war with itself. And so we'll go into more detail about what all that means as we go along. Now, to step into Islam itself, there are 1.6 billion adherents to Islam. They call themselves the Ummah, which is, if in Christian terms, it's kind of like the church, the people who are a member of the body of Christ, we would say in Christianity. 1.6 billion in the community, the Ummah. So you'll hear that term a lot when you talk to Muslims and people who are talking about the faith. They will talk about the Ummah. And there are just quite a few of them. But one thing that's really important for us to remember is that it's not a one-to-one relationship between Arabic and Muslim. Matter of fact, only 18%, less than 1 out of 5 people that you meet who are considering themselves Muslim are actually Arabic. 82% are non-Arabic. They don't even speak the Arabic language. You see over here the 5 top countries that have the most largest Muslim populations. None of them are actually Arabic countries. Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. And that is really important for us to know. Matter of fact, the next 5, you see finally we see some Arabic-speaking countries like Egypt that appear, but you even see like Iran, the Persian from the old Persian Empire, Turkey, which has its own language, and so you see that it would be a mistake for us just to assume that's all Arabic, and I know that's a very common assumption that we make in the West because of our low frequency of involvement with the daily Muslim community. So keep that in the back of your mind because it will surprise us and actually will make a lot of sense when we start talking about their interactions with the Quran and how teachings are passed between generations. So let's get into the history of Islam. It's the newest of the monotheistic faiths. It happened if you look at the story, and this is a map of the Middle East, actually the Mediterranean area. This is where most of the Islamic activity has happened. And Muhammad was actually born in 570 in the Common Era and died in 632. So that's almost 600 years, 550 years after Jesus lived on earth. So it gives you a perspective that it did come much later. And down in the Arabic subcontinent, on the far west side, is the Hijaz area, and we'll find that many of the things that happen in the history happen along that coastline of the Arabian Peninsula, and so that will become very important to us. 570, Muhammad was born. His father passed away while he was before he was born. His mother passed away very shortly after he was born. He was then his grandfather was raising him, and then he passed away just a few years later. And then ultimately, he was his uncle Abu Talib became his caregiver, and for the longest time he worked with his uncle, and learned a lot about business and life from his uncle. And this is all was happening in Mecca at the time. This is where they lived. In 595, when Muhammad was 25 years of age, he got a job the year before from a lady named Khadijah. She was a businesswoman, and he started leading caravans for her. And so he became kind of a caravan leader and got to know her well. And a year later, after his working, she was so impressed by his honesty and his hard work, and that they ended up getting married, even though she was 15 years older than Muhammad. And so they became a married couple and lived together until Khadijah died. And it was, from all we can tell, a very joyous marriage. As a matter of fact, Khadijah is considered the first convert to Islam. When Muhammad was 40, so this is about 610 AD, Muhammad received his first vision. It was in a cave outside of Mecca. And the angel Gabriel came to him one night while he was camping out in this cave, and there's lots of great stories about this. And if you ever want to get into some of the hadith literature about what happened that night, it's an important night in the history of the Islamic faith. The angel Gabriel comes and tells Muhammad to recite, and tells him 3 times to recite. And he says, "What should I recite?" And then at that point, a long-lasting conversation and appearances of Gabriel came to Muhammad and would dictate to him, tell him, say, recite these words, and that became actually the words of the Qur'an. And so that began in 610 AD, and it continued all the way through to the end of Muhammad's life. In 622, Muhammad flees to Medina. Medina is about 200 miles away from Mecca, and Muhammad and his teachings were actually causing a little bit of trouble inside of Mecca. He was fighting against a polytheistic religion where actually many people came in to Mecca every year to worship at the Kaaba, which we'll talk about more in just a little bit. But there was a special shrine where there were purportedly 300 or more deities worshipped at the Kaaba. And of course, Muhammad, through his revelations from Gabriel, the archangel Gabriel, where he was learning that no, there's only a one God. All these other gods are not gods at all. And so he was preaching that very hard and discouraging people from worshiping in Mecca. Of course, the people in Mecca were very concerned about this because that was a livelihood of them. All this traffic, this tourism to see the Kaaba. And so Muhammad didn't make any friends. Finally, they heard that his life was being threatened. So Muhammad and some of his followers fled, found a group of people in Medina, in the town which would ultimately be called Medina. It wasn't at the time, but they fled there and would stay there for that was about a couple hundred miles away, and it was a little oasis town, an agricultural town. And so from 622 until the end of Muhammad's life, he is in Medina. Now this is an important change point in Muhammad's life. And we'll find out that when we look at the Quran, we'll see the recitations that he receives before Medina have a interesting character to them, and the recitations he receives from Gabriel after this time have a different flavor to them. It's important for us to understand that, and we'll actually in our next talk about the significance of the Meccan and the Medinan verses. In 630, actually, Muhammad goes and recaptures Mecca, and there's a raid and a battle that's fought, and Mecca is actually recaptured. At that time, Muhammad goes to the Kaaba. I'll show you a picture of the Kaaba in just a little bit. And then they actually cleanse that Kaaba, and it becomes a very significant part of the Muhammad's new religion called Islam. And you'll find out that when we start talking about the Hajj, the pilgrimage, everyone is going to see going to Mecca and going to the Kaaba. And so that'll be an important conversation for us to have. In 632, Muhammad dies. Okay, and when he does, he dies suddenly from a fever, and so he had not prepared the Ummah to be able to handle succession. He hadn't gone that far, so there was a lot of debate after that about who should be leading the community after Muhammad. And so there's a huge debate that breaks out. During the period right after that, all the way from to 632 to 661, the Rashidun Caliphs are there. There are 4 caliphs. We won't go into much detail here, but it's a really interesting history. If you ever get a chance to read any of the history around the life of Muhammad, especially from Medina forward into the Rashidun Caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs, there are 4 of them. Abu Bakr is the first, and then there's Umar, and then there's and then it ends up with Ali. Now Ali becomes very significant because of the Shiite movement. We'll talk about Shiism in just a second. But during this Rashidun Caliph period is when we actually see the formation of the Qur'an in written form. So that becomes really important for us to know. And that becomes a really kind of a solidifying of the teachings of Islam. And so that kind of history is really important for us to know. So keep that in the back of your mind, because we'll keep talking about these periods and the significance of them as we go along. At the end of the Rashidun Caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs, we see a split between Sunni and Shia. The Sunni are those who are following, the leader who was actually elected by the Ummah, or at least chosen by the Ummah to actually be the leader. And the Shia actually is saying, no, it should be actually the line of Muhammad by blood should actually lead the Ummah. And Ali is actually a descendant of Muhammad. He's the last of the 4 Rashidun Caliphs. And Shia actually is the people who follow Ali. And right now in the world, there are 80 to 85% of the Muslims in the world are what we'll call Sunni, and about 15 to 20% are Shia. And so there is a lot of rift between these two, and they don't like each other very much. And I guess you probably can pick that out when you see some of the history, especially when you see Iran, which is where a lot of the Shia are. That's also a large contingency, even in Saudi Arabia, but as it wraps up into Iraq, you see some Shia, and also in Lebanon. Sunni are pretty much predominantly everything else. And so just to keep that thought as you go forward. And there's a lot of war here between these two, a lot of stress between these two branches of Islam. And we'll go into more detail as we go along. Let's talk a little about the theology. Islamic theology is an interesting thing for us who are non-Muslim, because it has a few hanging themes behind it that may be a little bit different than we're used to. Well, first of all, they are promoting what they call absolute monotheism. And that is one of the greatest tenets of what Muhammad was always teaching. There's only one God. His name is Allah. And that one God is the only God there is. There aren't any other gods. There are not lesser gods. There are not gods who are from other places that just aren't as strong as Allah. Allah is the God, the great creator God. And so they are fighting for that idea of monotheism very strongly. They are actually more closely allied with the Jewish tradition of one God, Yahweh, than they are with the Christian idea of God, which believes in the Trinity. Now, their version of monotheism has to do with the singularity of God. God is one. And when it comes to the Trinity, which the Christian view of monotheism is that there's unity in the plurality of God's persons. And that is something that the Muslim world just cannot understand. And they don't think it makes any sense. They think it's actually an accretion on the true religion, which actually is best represented by Muhammad. and that the Christians have gotten it all wrong, and they have deified Jesus and created the Holy Spirit in order for them to be able to manage their theology. And all of that is against the idea that there is only one God in the world. And so they are very jealous of this thought. So you'll hear a lot about that in their conversation. Here's a passage in the Quran to give us a little bit of taste of how the Quran refers to it. This is Quran, Surah 112. This is the entire Surah. There are 114 surahs in the Quran. The surah is like chapters to us. So if you ever heard that term before, a surah, it really is kind of like a chapter. And there are 114 of them. And they're arranged not by date or by theme or by story. They're arranged actually by length. So the longest surahs, except for the first one, the first one's short, but Surah 2, Surah 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, 9, all these are long passages. Some of them have over 200 verses in them. And then they go all the way to Surah 114. As they get toward the end of the Quran, they become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And you see at Surah 112, the third to the last in the whole series in the Quran, you see how short it is. And this is what it says. In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, say, He is God the One, God the Eternal. He begot no one, nor was he begotten. No one is comparable to him. You see how definitive they are in their monotheism from the Quranic verses that are here in this surah. He is one. He was not begotten. He did not beget, which actually takes Jesus off the table. You say that he's the begotten Son of God, as in the Christian tradition. Nor was he begotten. He was not begotten by anything or anyone or any kind of power or whatever. No one is comparable to him. There's nothing else in the world that's like God. And that's important. And they call God Allah. And I've got here just God in these. I'm actually using a translation by Abd al-Halim, who is actually a great Muslim scholar, and he's translated into modern English the Quran. I wouldn't say translate; it's really an interpretation of the Quran. We'll talk more about that in our next talk about what that means. But anyhow, you see here that the word God is used a lot, Allah, and that is a very common term. So if you talk to Muslims about God in general, they talk about Allah, so they use that term. Actually, if some of the Christian Bibles written in Arabic, they talk about God as Allah, because that's what the common term for God is. So when we say "for God so loved the world," if we're writing in Arabic, we say "for Allah loved the world, so loved the world," and that's exactly what that means. There are some people in the Muslim tradition who would like for Christians to stop using the term Allah because it's confusing the Muslims, that they think that we're actually talking about the same God. They don't see it that way. And there was a big movement in Malaysia just recently where they have outlawed the use of the term Allah by non-Muslims. So a lot of the Christian texts and Christian Bibles that were written in languages that are familiar to that part of the country have now been deemed illegal to use the term Allah. So that kind of shows you how much strong they think of it. And there are a lot of people in Christianity who will not use the term Allah, but it's just like Deus or Dios or God or whatever phrase we'd use in any other language. Allah is what God is called in Arabic. So just a little bit of knowledge there. Another thing about their theology that's really important to understand is that Allah is most concerned about protecting his cosmos, not pursuing a relationship with man. This is critical to understand as well, is that this is something different for many of us who have seen God creating this cosmos as a way of having or entering a relationship with man. They're saying, no. God has created this wonderful thing called the world and all the systems and all the things that are part of it. Man is part of it, but we have an obligation to keep the cosmos as God intended, and that's really our responsibility. Whereas in the Christian tradition, we talk a lot about God being our Father, which a lot of Muslims are offended by. He says, how can God actually be a father to anyone? He did not begot anybody. He created us. We're just creation. We are not family members of God. That doesn't make any sense. God is way above us. Matter of fact, it's really good to even think of Muslims as best understood as slaves of Allah. You'll see that a lot in the Hadith. We'll talk about the Hadith in a bit. But the writings in and around the Quran, you'll see this idea that really we're not sons of Allah. We're not anything, but we're actually slaves. That's the best way to understand it. God has created this world. He has put us here, but it is His will. It is His methods. It is His interests that are only important. We are here to only serve. So we're slaves. Another thing to really is interesting about Islam that we need to understand, especially for we Christians, especially, we frame everything in the way of belief. That right believing is what really actually leads to spirituality. But for Muslims and a lot of people in most other religions, that's not necessarily the case. For Islam, it doesn't matter so much what you believe as about what you do. There's only one really belief system, and that is actually the first of the 5 pillars of Islam. We'll talk about that in a second. Is that there's only one statement of belief, and the rest of it is all about what you do. It's whether you pray, it's whether you give alms, whether you do these things, it's whether you actually are a good Muslim. And that's the most important thing, not what you believe. That's different in Christianity, where belief systems and faith are really the driving forces behind it all, and that's the reason why there's so much emphasis on theology in Christianity, whereas you'll find out more about orthopraxy as opposed to orthodoxy being the driving force behind a lot of Islamic behavior. Important for us to keep that in the back of our minds. Here's a great verse from the Quran that will help us understand that better. This is from Surah 95. It starts off, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. By the fig, by the olive, by Mount Sinai, by this safe town, we create man in the finest state when we then reduce him to the lowest of the low, except those who believe and do good deeds. They will have an unfailing reward. After this, what makes you, man, deny the judgment? Is God not the most decisive of judges? So you sense this idea that do these things. You were created. Except those who believe and do good deeds, they will have an unfailing reward. So it's all about, when you face judgment, do you have the good deeds behind your life in order to be able to enter into God's heaven. And that's an important conversation. One thing you'll also notice at the very top, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, you'll see that phrase starting every surah, except for one, all throughout the Quran. And that's really interesting for us to know. It's a nice thing that they're constantly reminded of when they read the Quran. The Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. That's how they frame God's personality. Islam, they consider themselves correcting all the corruption that has been caused by Judaism and Christianity. They are the final religion, the completion and the correction of all other religions. They look at Christianity differently. Even they are very, very fond of the Christian religion, and especially of Jesus and of John the Baptist and all those. And they're very fond of the holy men of Judaism, like Moses. And so you see, they hold them in high regard because they are true people. Matter of fact, Jesus is a great prophet in the tradition of Islam. But the problem is that he's not the Son of God in their worldview. Jesus is just a great prophet that Paul made divine. That's why we say Paul is not somebody they revere. They actually look at Paul as actually subverting a lot of Christianity and teaching this whole new version of Christianity and reframing Jesus from being just a great prophet to being God's son and being co-equal with God. And this is a problem for Islam. And so they look at Paul as being a subverter of Christianity. So, and the New Testament is just filled with lots of corruptions. And not because of the Christian people are corrupt. It's just the religion that they've been taught has been based on a corruption, which is actually the New Testament. This makes it really interesting for us as we talk to Muslims, is that when we start using New Testament verses to talk about our faith, they're kind of wincing at it and saying, no, that's you don't understand. That's a corruption. How can you rely upon that? Muhammad has come into this world, and he has been, chosen by God to give us this recitation we call the Quran, and that is what we have. And what you have as a sacred scripture is filled with all kinds of problems, and that's what they're taught. So keep that in the back of your mind. Let's talk a little about the Quran, this incredible book that is at the center and is the foundation of all things Islamic. I've given you two spellings. The one with the Q at the top, the Quran, is what you see a lot today. It's the most widely used spelling in English. You may see some of the older writings just be with the Koran, Quran. Both of those are totally acceptable, but for modern purposes, you probably see Quran with Qur, starting the name being much more noticed. What it means, the word itself means the recitation. That's what it really means. So it goes back to Gabriel saying recite, and this is the recitation. It is not a divinely inspired book. It's not Muhammad writing under the inspiration of God. It's actually a divine thing itself that Muhammad only is dictating and hearing and repeating and reciting to the Ummah exactly what God is wanting us to know. As a matter of fact, Muslims believe it is co-eternal with Allah. It has always been. The Quran is in heaven with God, and it is co-eternal with God. And that now that we have it, it's just been because of God's mercy that has been spoken through the final prophet, Muhammad. And because of that, it is above criticism. To criticize using a human means of rationality and thought and exegesis and all this kinds of stuff makes no sense. It's a divine work. For how filled with hubris we must be to think that we can actually take something that's divine like the Quran and be able to tear it apart and say what it means and say what's wrong with it and find errors. That's boldness beyond pride. That's foolishness. And that's what they're taught. So anybody who tries to criticize the Quran actually is highly, they think they're very dangerous. And that's why you see a lot of problems with people who try to speak out against Quranic teaching. Here's a great surah passage in the Quran that kind of tips its hat in this direction. It says, if you have doubts about the revelation we have sent down, oh, by the way, we, on our servant, some people say, well, isn't that saying that there's a multiplicity of gods there, or that could be the Trinity? No, and that's actually just the royal we. So don't get that confused, and don't use that as evidence that they actually think that God is a plurality. That is not what they think. That is, God is a singularity, a one. So when you see the capital we in the our in the translations, it's not to give us any other indication but that it is a special royal we, like Queen Elizabeth would use about herself in the English tradition. If you have doubts about the revelation we have sent down to our servant, then produce a single surah like it. Enlist whatever supporters you have other than God, if you truly think you can. If you cannot do this, and you never will, then beware of the fire prepared for the disbelievers, whose fuel is men and stones. Now that must be some kind of fire that actually stones itself is using as fuel for that fire. That fire must be intense. You can see now why there are a lot of people who just don't even go there. Don't try to produce in a single surah. Don't even try to do anything to actually contradict or to countermand the Quran. If you do, you're playing with fire, and it's the fire that's prepared for the disbeliever. So you can see why a lot of people in the Muslim world just treat the Quran with such respect. As a matter of fact, there are many people who actually, it's not just many people, it's the entire Ummah who feel this way. The Quran is such a sacred book, you never place another book on top of it. If you have a stack of books on your table and the Quran's part of it, it needs to be on the very top. It needs to be in the most prominent place in the house or in your office or wherever you are. It should never touch the ground. And so there's a lot of those kinds of traditions around the Quran that show their intensity of respect for this revelation from God. And that's really important for us to know, and we should be treating the Quran with respect. The Quran is part of their teaching and the way that they actually make decisions, but there's also a group of writings outside of the Quran called the Hadith. Now, there's a lot of writings that contribute to the Hadith, and it kind of reminds us a little bit of the Talmud of Judaism, doesn't it? It's a group of writings that are accepted by the Ummah that are important. The more the more valued hadith are those that are written closer to the time of Muhammad and tell directly of his story. They're stories of Muhammad, his things that he said, things that he's done. And so those hadith stories and those hadith teachings are really important. And a lot of the information that is informing Sharia law comes out of the hadith and not just the Quran. And so there's some debates about what's the most reliable hadith. And some very strong, purists of Islam just only look at the hadith that are very close to Muhammad and his life, and any of the more recent hadith writings are less valuable. So that's important to also keep in the back of your mind. Another part of the Islamic theology has to do with the 5 pillars. And this is important for anyone to understand because you'll see some of the most critical areas of concern for those who practice Islam. The first is called the Shahada, the testimony of faith, and it's the only really faith statement that's required. This is almost like their creed. And it's down here. It says, there is no true God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And that is the Shahada. And so they repeat that a lot in their prayers and when they gather together in their mosques or even in conversation with each other. There is no true God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. You hear that quite often. It is a very important phrase for them. And Muhammad taught, if you truly espouse to this idea, you are Muslim. And that was what he taught. And so what's really fascinating, there are a lot of Muslims who are fighting each other and even declaring jihad on each other. We'll talk a lot about that in our next conversation, that they're attacking people who are of the faith because they are actually espousing to the Shahada. And they're saying these words. And so important to understand. The second one is what we call the Salat, the 5 daily prayers. This is what, of course, a lot of Muslims are famous for. When we see them is that at dawn, as the sun is about to rise, there's a prayer. At noon, there's a time of prayer. Mid-afternoon, they pray again. Sunset, they pray. And then at night, there is a prayer before they go to bed. And so these 5 daily prayers are very ritualized. And there are certain things that they say, certain prayers that they pray that are very important. But what's really fascinating about this, and we'll talk a lot about what it means to be Muslim next conversation, is that this really keeps them centered on the presence of God. And that's really a remarkable thing. And their God awareness is really large in this religion. It's very easy for many people in the Christian tradition to really lose sight of God and his presence in this world, just because we have not as many touch points of prayer and of contemplation of God. And so this is a rich part of the Muslim tradition. And there are a lot of Christian men over the years who have been fascinated by this. I think it's even informed a lot of the prayer rituals that even people like St. Francis of Assisi practiced, because he saw just the devotion of prayer that some Muslims had, and that informed his faith. So that goes back to our conversation about Christopher Stendhal, something we can really learn. Third one is zakat, and that is actually the support of the needy. Our purification is the giving of alms, and that's an important part of the third pillar of Islam. This is an important part of what you would do as a Muslim, is that make sure that you are giving alms to the poor, and that's really a part of your purification. I mean, that is what is very important, not just to relieve the stress and anxiety of the poor, but to really help purify your own faith. The fourth part is Ramadan, which is on the lunar calendar, just so you know, if you've gotten kind of confused of when Ramadan is. It's not every April or whatever. Matter of fact, it's June in 2016. And it'll be in May in 2017. So it gives you kind of a sense of where it is. But Ramadan is actually a 30-day period where you actually fast during the day. You don't eat anything from the sunrise to the sunset. Now, for people who live in very northern climates, that can be very interesting for them, especially when it comes to happening in the summer. They have to wait a long time to eat. But Ramadan is not just about fasting. That's really important. It's a purification of, just of your mind, and gives you a chance to reflect. A lot of people read through the entire Quran during the month of Ramadan. They break it up into 30 pieces, and every day they take 1/30 of the Quran and read it. And there's after sunset of every day of Ramadan, they have wonderful feasts. And so there are many Muslims who complain they gain weight during Ramadan because of all the amazing food that's cooked and all the community celebrations that happen during the month of Ramadan. And that's really an important thing. When I read and have heard testimony of people who have converted to Islam, they say that Ramadan is what really gave them a real appreciation of the Islamic faith and just how special it is. So that's a really important thing. And the fifth pillar is what we call the Hajj. It's the pilgrimage to Mecca, and that is a picture of the Kaaba inside of Mecca. If you are a non-Muslim, you will not be able to enter and come to this. But during your life, sometime in your lifetime, you are expected as a Muslim, if you have the means and the health to do so, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so millions of observant Muslims do make this trip to Mecca as in their lives, and to be able to go to the Kaaba, and they circumambulate it, which is actually a tradition that has been with the Kaaba for a long time. This Kaaba actually is purported by Muslims to be a place where actually Abraham and Ishmael built. And the story of Abraham and Ishmael is really important to the Muslim, to the Islamic faith. And they think that the Jewish story of Abraham and Isaac is a lifted or re-articulated story of really what happened between Abraham and Ishmael. As a matter of fact, they believe that Abraham actually was trying to sacrifice Ishmael when he was that famous story in the Old Testament. That was Ishmael, not Isaac. That should be part of that story. So now you know. The Hajj is actually the fifth of the 5 parts of the pillar, the 5 pillars, and it's something that is really important to really observant Muslims. And when you go and you've done this before, you get the name Haji. So you're a Haji if you have done this. So that's an important thing. If you ever hear somebody called Haji, they've actually taken the pilgrimage to Mecca. So here are the 5 pillars: the Shahada, the testimony of faith, the Salat, the 5 daily prayers, Zakat, which is support of the needy, the almsgiving. Ramadan is the month of fasting, and the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage. These are the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. So there we go. So that's our conversation for today. It's history of Islam, Islamic theology. Next time we talk, we're going to talk about what it's like to be Muslim, Islam and Christianity, and the Sharia law, jihad, and how to engage Muslims. So that will be our conversation. If you are wanting to see the world through a converted a Muslim who's converted to Christianity, I've read both of these books. They're fantastic. Nabil Qureshi is actually a doctor who now has really dedicated his life to apologetics and to public speaking about what the Muslim world is like, and to be able to speak on behalf of Muslims who have been converted to Christianity. This is a really marvelous writing. You'll find out a lot about, and you'll fall in love with actually a lot of things about Islam, and some of the great things it does for the families that practice it, what it means to be Muslim in a pluralistic society. He also has written a book that's actually just released in March of 2016, The Answering Jihad. Great book, very well researched, and very accessible writing. So I'd encourage you to look at those two if you're interested. So anyhow, thank you, and I hope this has been helpful. And stick around for lesson 5 when we go into this a little more deeply. Thank you.